So 3D Wrap are an Italian-based company that are pretty well known in the sim racing industry for a lot of their 3D printed mods that they make for more entry-level gear. So things like their little urethane mods for Logitech pedals, one of their better known products. They do a lot of adapters and things for Logitech wheels, Thrustmaster wheels, and things like that. Now, during the pandemic, as a lot of you would know, Italy was one of the hardest hit countries in the earliest stages, and 3D Wrap assigned a lot of their resources to helping out the medical industry, hospitals, and things like that. But they've also been focusing on a more mid to high level range called their Ignition series. The first two products being the new Pikes shifter and Akina handbrake. Now, they recently sent me an email asking me if I would be keen to check out these products and do a review video. And here we are today. So let's take a closer look at these new products from 3D Wrap. Okay, so just before we do get into a closer look at the products, one thing that I do need to point out that is a little bit disappointing, and I think it's something that they can improve on, is the packaging was this polystyrene foam, and unfortunately in my case, the polystyrene was all smashed to pieces, and it ended up with this little tiny beads all through everything, and I literally had to spend at least half an hour pulling apart the products and cleaning it all out. There's still a little bit in there that I haven't been able to get out. You can see just in the corner of the handbrake there. So a little bit disappointed with that. I mean, it just seems so unnecessary when, you know, if they'd use packaging like what we have here with the podium hub, for example, that nice foam packaging does the same job, protects it in transport, but completely removes the risk of things like that happening. So, I mean, that's not going to be everybody's experience. Obviously, it was unlucky that it broke, but just one little suggestion to the guys at 3D Wrap: if you change your packaging material, that won't happen to people. But anyway, let's move on to the important part, which is of course the product. So both very sturdy in design, and we'll talk about weights and dimensions and things like that in just a moment. I apologize in advance for the fingerprints. These things, being stainless steel, are absolute fingerprint magnets, and I've given up trying to keep them clean. So yeah, apologies for that. But let's put the handbrake aside for now and just have a look at the shifter, and then we'll have a look at the handbrake a little later. Now, one thing that I do want to call out here is that their website is absolutely fantastic. There's a whole bunch of detail, really good quality animations that show how a lot of the internal workings here. So we're actually going to use that as a reference throughout this video to sort of cross across and show you how things work internally, as well as taking the cover off to show you inside. But I would definitely recommend checking that out. And for other manufacturers that might be watching this video as well and keeping an eye on the competition, yeah, take note, because this is easily the best website I've seen for a sim racing product. But onto the important stuff. So we've got a weight of 0.8 kilograms, 800 grams, a mixture of satin steel and 3D printed plastic for the construction as well. And let's just get up nice and close on that so you can see the details. So, I mean, you can see very clearly that it is 3D printed. It doesn't have that nice finish on it that an injected molded plastic would have. That's gonna bother some people. Admittedly, I do find it a little bit annoying because I like to have that nice refined kind of finish, but it is kind of functional and purposeful in its design. So some people might actually like that element of it, but it is what it is, purely subjective, but you guys can see the quality there. But the steel, from what I understand, is laser cut, very fine. There's no sharp edges or anything that you're likely to catch yourself on at all. So yeah, look, overall construction-wise, it is what it is. Not the best looking sim racing product I've ever seen, but far from the worst. And we've got a nice long, just under 2 meter long, braided USB cable as well. Now, the handle itself, they're calling an Alcantara-like material. Now, I'm gonna be honest with you guys, I'm not a huge fan of this. You can see there's a little split there on it already, and I don't know, that, like, that's just before I've even used it. That's fresh out of the box. And just the quality of the stitching is not fantastic. You can see, you know, just not up to the standard that we're used to from a lot of other products. And it's kind of this foam material, so it doesn't feel anything like Alcantara to me, to be honest with you. It's not gonna beat up or ball up. I mean, it feels fine. There's nothing wrong with it, but yeah, I wouldn't say it feels like Alcantara. And you can actually see the little divots there where I push in. So I think what's underneath that is probably just a 3D printed piece of plastic. You can see the seam in between there as well, where it's wedged up against the metal. And then it's just wrapped around. So there's no squishiness to it whatsoever. It's completely solid. And then if you squeeze on it, you can actually feel where the screw holes are. But yeah, I feel like they could have done better in terms of the quality of the overall grip. It's just not up to the standard that I would expect for something that costs this much money. And it's not something that you're going to notice when you're driving, particularly with gloves on. But yeah, you got to call these sorts of things out for what they are. And yeah, I'm a little bit disappointed with that. But anyway, let's move on. So in terms of mounting to your rig, obviously this is going to depend on the rig that you have, but we've got 2 mounting holes here, which are part of the stainless structure. So nice and solid, and we'll comment on this once we're driving a little bit later on, but I don't anticipate that there's going to be any flex or anything like that in those. It should just bolt cleanly straight down to our aluminium profile on my P1X. It's got a really clever magnetic design, which we'll have a look at in just a moment. But we've got a 2.5 centimeter or 25 millimeter throw here. So when we pull it, we're releasing a couple of magnets. So we've got to overcome the magnetic force, which requires 2 kilograms of force. And then as we pull it back, it becomes light once we release those magnets, and then it pulls back quite nicely. And you can hear the switch there clicking as we reach the bump stop. So you do have to pull it all the way to activate the shift. It's not a case of just simply releasing the magnet and then letting go again. So you do have to actually purposefully click it all the way, just the way as you would in a real life race car with a mechanical sequential gearbox, where you have to pull all the way back to fully engage the next gear. So we can see here on the website the clever design that they've used with the spring that compresses regardless of which way you're pulling the shifter. And you can see the little magnets on the top as well, which are what you need to overcome with that 2 kilograms of force. And if we scroll down a little bit here, we can see they've actually got a little graph. Now, I don't know how accurate this is, but it says here 2 kilograms of force to overcome the initial magnetic strength. And then obviously as you get past that, as the spring compresses, it gets stiffer and stiffer and stiffer as it pulls up. But yeah, really nice touch on the website there, illustrating that detail. But let's just pop the cover off now quickly, and we'll have a look at what it looks like inside in the real world. Now, they've included a nice little overview sheet here, which shows you how to replace the switches too. So what we're going to do in this case is we're just going to remove the 2 screws that are holding the top cover in place, pop that off, and we'll be able to have a good look inside. But it is definitely nice that they've kind of kept that in mind and made it possible to replace that contact switch should you ever need to do so. So let's set that aside now. You can see I've already removed this 3D printed piece of plastic. And now we can see the inside. You can see there's still a little bit of that polystyrene dust inside there that I was talking about before, despite me cleaning it out earlier. But inside we've got 2 contact switches, so one on either side. So obviously when we pull back, it activates either switch. Nice little spade connectors on those as well, so they are easily replaceable. You just pull off the spade connector, undo the 2 bolts, so that one, and the switch will just come out and can be easily replaced. Look, honestly, I highly doubt you would ever need to replace these switches anyway, but you can if you need to. But anyway, let's have a closer look at how this mechanism actually works on the top here. So when we shift, we can see there's 2 little what look like neodymium magnets sitting in there, and then 2 on the opposing side there as well. And then if we flip it around, the exact same thing on the other side. So that's what gives us that initial magnetic force that's fighting against us. And then on either side, we've got these yellow bump stops, which are slightly squishy to give it that nice feel when you hit into the bump stop. So not too much flex there, just the right amount, I would say. So you can feel a little bit of resistance there, a little bit of squishiness, but not too much. And those, I believe, are constructed of thermoplastic polyurethane, which is the same as what they use to manufacture the brake pedal mods. But look, there's a little bit of play there before we release the magnets as well. You can see the whole assembly kind of moves back and forth a little bit before engaging the mechanism in both directions. But there's minimal play from side to side, and we do have a nice solid shifter bar there as well, which is just under 6 millimeters thick. Now, it is interesting to see that they've used 3D printed plastics internally as well. So what I'm going to do is hold off on releasing this review for a few weeks. I'll use this shifter and the handbrake as well for a while and see if we do have any issues with wear and tear. We should be able to see pretty quickly whether there's any sort of residue or build up from the plastic sort of breaking down or wearing out over time. So we'll definitely comment on that once we go for a drive and look at our final thoughts. Just before we put it back together again, you can see the little spring in there too. So no adjustability there, which is unfortunate. It would have been nice to be able to adjust that spring tension, but I don't really see any reason why you couldn't just pop that spring out and replace it with a different one should you wish to do so. But yeah, look, I mean, I don't have a problem personally with the amount of spring tension that's there, maybe a little bit on the weak side, but you know, some people might find it's absolutely spot on. It's purely a subjective thing. But anyway, let's get us closed back on now and have a look at the handbrake. So onto the handbrake now. Very similar fundamental design to the shifter as we would expect. 3D printed plastic, again with stainless steel housings. Exactly the same Alcantara-like material as we saw before with the shifter. And again, a few issues with the quality of the stitching you can see there. Certainly not the best I've seen. But unlike the shifter, we actually do have quite a lot of adjustability this time around. So let's have a look at that in a little bit more detail. So same stainless steel mounts that we saw with the shifter, but this time around we can mount this horizontally or vertically. So if we're mounting horizontally, we'd have the shifter in this orientation. If we mount vertically, then we can actually rotate that up and then we can pull the shifter down like so. So quite a clever design there, and I think that probably will be the way I'll end up mounting it on my rig, simply because of the way my design is set up at the moment. But it's very clever the way they've designed that, so you can use either or anywhere in between as well if you want to have it on a precise angle. Now, unlike with the shifter, we do have a couple of other points of adjustment here as well, both electronically and physically. So we've got a little linear and non-linear adjustment here, which is like adjusting a little cam, and we'll take a look at that in just a moment internally. But basically this swings around to non-linear or linear. If we have a look at the website, we can actually see how that adjusts internally on their little animation as well, from linear down to non-linear. And then we've got a preload adjustment here as well. So we've got a little 3D printed wheel, which we can loosen off. And that's essentially just adjusting the preload of the spring underneath here. So talking about the mechanism itself, no play in this one whatsoever. So as soon as you start moving it, you feel the spring fighting against you immediately. There's no side to side flex or anything like that going on either. So it all feels really nice and solid. I know it does look a little bit like a toaster, but I'm actually pretty fond of this design overall. We've got 30 millimeters of travel here, as I measured before, from the base. Obviously that depends on how high up you measure it because it's on an angle, but 30 millimeters of travel there. And that spring load, I found for me driving, I like to have it set to the maximum, but you've got a fair amount of adjustment there from 7 kilos all the way down. But importantly as well, when we switch between linear and non-linear here, we also have a little switch on the back, and you can see there a non-linear and a linear sweep. So we flick the switch to the corresponding position depending on which response we want, and that alters the response electronically as well to match. And they recommend using non-linear for things like drifting and rally cars, and linear for driving conventional cars. But we'll obviously comment on all that a lot more once we go for a drive. Let's pop the cover off quickly now and just have a quick look at the internals. So surprisingly simple design internally, despite how complex it looks at first glance. So there's a little 3D printed sprocket here, and I'll just quickly carefully lift this up for you. Be very careful how I can lift it up. You can see the little potentiometer hiding down there in the corner. So that's what gives us our reading for our handbrake position. So a 3D printed cog system to achieve that. And we'll definitely come back and have a look at that later on to see whether we see any wear and tear after a couple of weeks of usage. But they've used a different type of 3D printed material. It looks like it's 3D printed for this, and I don't know what that material is, but it all looks to be very well thought out and using the right grade of materials where necessary. So we can see a nice solid spring there, but everything appears to be high grade where necessary. And we can see here as well how we adjust between the two different modes. So I've taken the spring tension off the spring at the moment, just so we didn't get pieces flying everywhere. But we can see here, if we slide it up, that takes us into our linear mode, as we can see indicated on the panel there. And then we slide it back down again, and that takes us into our non-linear mode. So very simple in design, but definitely gets the job done. But we'll definitely keep an eye on those 3D printed parts there, just to see if we do see any wear and tear or signs of cracking over time, because that is one spot where I could imagine there might be a little bit of weakness. But anyway, we'll comment on that later on once we've gone for a drive and we've had a chance to test everything out. So over to the rig now, you can see I've got the handbrake mounted vertically and the shifter mounted horizontally. No problems at all. Mounting the shifter went very, very easily onto the rig. The handbrake was a little bit more tricky. You can see I actually ended up using little standoffs instead of bolts, simply so I could get a wrench or a spanner onto those to tighten them down. The bottom one was very tricky to get to underneath the turning wheel. You can do it. You can loosen it off to get to it, but I just found this way easier. One observation with the handbrake though is that there is a little bit of side to side movement. Now this isn't a problem when you're driving, you don't really notice it, but it appears to be coming from where the metal is bended across, because we don't have a flat plate right across the entire length of the unit and there's that cutaway area. It does have a little bit of movement. The other immediate observation I had too was that the shifter is quite loud. Not only the click when you're shifting, which you'll hear when I'm driving, but the squeak in the spring itself as we're moving it around. Again, you don't really notice it when you're driving, but just have a quick listen now. Anyway, a quick look at the software before we head off on a drive. You don't need to install any drivers with these at all. If you plug it into a Windows PC, it will just detect it as a game input device and just work straight out of the box. Now, one thing that I did notice with the handbrake is there is quite a large dead zone, about 10%. If we go in here, you can see it jumps despite my movement. You can see with my hand there's There's nothing registered until you get to about 10%. Now, when you're driving, you don't really notice this because those small little applications of less than about 20% aren't really necessary anyway, but it is just something that I wanted to point out to you guys before we move on. Quickly having a look at the software for the shifter as well, it's literally just detected as 2 buttons, one for up and one for down. So very, very straightforward. So on to the driving experience now. So a lot of this is going to be purely subjective. Different people are going to like different things, but let's talk about the handbrake first. Now, I found that I was immediately quicker with this handbrake than any of the other handbrakes that I've been testing concurrently. So the FANATEC handbrake that I've been using for the last 18 months, as well as the ALOG's handbrake that I've been testing for the last couple of weeks at the same time as this one. So look, while I will admit I'm not the most advanced handbrake user, it's not the style of driving that I do regularly, hence the quality of my driving here. I found that I was able to adapt to this really quickly, and to the point where I was willing to ignore and sort of overlook those little niggles that I had with the build quality and things like that, and just enjoy the overall driving experience. I found that I was able to sort of really dial in with it, particularly with the amount of adjustment that was available. I could really fine tune exactly where I wanted that bite point to be and really feel and control exactly where the wheels would start to grip, so that if I was going around a hairpin turn or something like that, I could get it to really lock up, or if I just wanted a little bit of bite to help me sort of turn around a turn a little bit sharper than I could with just regular braking, I was able to achieve that pretty consistently as well. So yeah, overall very, very impressed and very, very happy with the handbrake. Unfortunately, the experience wasn't quite so good with the shifter. The first thing that I noticed, and as I pointed out previously, it is quite noisy, and the mix that I've got here in the video right now with the sound that you can hear in the background is about what it sounded like with the headphones turned up to a reasonable volume. So let me just be quiet for a moment here and let you listen for yourselves.
Right long, times 4. 30. Flat middle of a big jump.
So you could hear that sort of spring creaking around inside. It just doesn't have that, like if it was a nice mechanical sound like a real shifter in a real car, then you'd forgive it because it would sound realistic. But because it sounds sort of cheap and toy-like when it's shifting, it just kind of takes away from that immersion. Now, the other thing that honestly bothered me more while I was driving than I thought it would, I kind of thought in the heat of the moment with everything else going on, I'd kind of just forget about it. But that little bit of slop or slack in the shifter before it disengages the magnets was noticeable, and I found myself sort of playing with it while I was driving rather than taking my hand off the shifter and onto the wheel. Now, admittedly, I do have a habit of keeping my hand on the shifter rather than on the wheel, which is something that I do in real life as well, and I'm always getting in trouble for it. But yeah, I did find that because that slack was there, I was constantly aware of it, and again, it just kind of took away from that immersion. I did also find that, as I suspected in my initial impressions, the spring tension wasn't quite what I would like it to be. I would like it to be a lot stiffer. I think that would make it feel a lot more realistic. But again, that is a purely subjective thing. Some people might appreciate that there's less effort required to change gear. And while they are relatively small niggles that I'm sure can be fixed in the future, they just did take away from the overall driving experience and the level of immersion that I'm used to. So yeah, I did struggle to get along with the shifter. One thing that I did like, however, was the amount of throw. I felt like they've got the right idea and they're definitely on the right path with the magnetic system. It does feel like a nice mechanical clunk when you release it, but it's just not quite stiff enough. And despite having that amount of throw present there, because the spring is so loose, you just don't really feel like you're making full use of that available throw. So yeah, definitely a thumbs up for the handbrake, but I'm going to find it a little bit more difficult to recommend the shifter, I think.
Flat middle of a crest, 50. Right tightens, opens of a crest, 80. Flat small crest.
Okay, so at the start of the video, I mentioned that I'd come back and check to see whether there was any issues with wear and tear. I had some concerns around the 3D printed sprocket, particularly on the handbrake, and I'm happy to report, pulled everything back apart again to the same level as we did before when we showed you the insides. And yeah, absolutely no residue, no signs of wear and tear, no cracks, no nothing. There was no residue or powder or anything like that left behind on the rig when I pulled it off either. So I don't see any issues based off the 2 weeks of abuse that I've given these to be concerned about longevity whatsoever. I don't see any wear and tear. You know, the feel of the shifter and the handbrake hasn't changed really at all either, other than a little bit around the looseness here, which I'll talk about in just a moment. But yeah, look, overall, particularly with the handbrake, no issues whatsoever. Another thing that I was a little bit concerned about with the handbrake is that because a lot of these bolts are required for adjustment, I thought we might have a few issues with things working their way loose and then slipping out of adjustment. But yeah, it hasn't been any issues like that to speak of whatsoever. And remember that I am running this in a pretty much worst case scenario with a motion platform as well as a SimuCube 2 Ultimate bolted to the same rig. So I think if it was going to fail, it probably would have failed by now. So that is good news for the Handbrake. Now, in terms of the shifter, I did do a little bit of further investigation to see if I could figure out why we had this movement here. And it does seem to be just fundamental to the design, but let me know in the comments below if you own one of these, whether you've had a similar experience. Now, I did do a little bit of experimentation. I tightened these two bolts as well as the opposing ones on the rear a little bit further than I had previously, or than they came from factory. And it did actually make a little bit of a difference, but what I found it's actually doing is it's sandwiching that 3D printed block of plastic in there and basically using friction to stop it from moving. So it's not really designed to be restricted in that manner. And basically what's happening then is every time you shift, you're putting friction on that plastic, and over time it will wear that plastic down and we'll be right back where we started again. So I backed it back off to exactly the same way as it was when it came out of the box originally. Now, just on that subject as well, I should mention that I mentioned at the start of the video that we had issues with polystyrene all over everything from the packaging. When I opened them up to clean that up, all I did was remove the top cover and the front plate on the Handbrake, exactly the same as I did in the video when I showed you inside as well. So we followed the instructions and we just did what was shown there to open up the Handbrake. So yeah, I don't feel like it's anything that I've done that's caused this slack in the mechanism here. I do think that it's just fundamental to the design. But again, let me know in the comments if you've had a different experience, because I think that that's the important thing to remember here, is that this is just my own experience and my own opinions, and everybody's experience and opinions will vary from me as well. So the more people that comment and let us know about their experience, the better off we are as a community. But look, overall, very, very happy with the Handbrake. I think that, you know, as I said, that's probably the best Handbrake that I've tested. I haven't tested a whole bunch of them, but comparing it to the ALOG's Handbrake that I've been testing concurrently alongside this for the last couple of weeks, as well as comparing to the FANATEC Handbrake that I've been interchanging with them as well for the last 3 or 4 weeks, and I've been using that Handbrake for the last couple of years now. And admittedly, I don't do a lot of driving that requires a Handbrake, but I did find immediately, as I said in the driving section, that I was able to adapt to this one much more quickly than I have previous ones, and really able to make use of the adjustment that's available here, and really, you know, work with that bite point to control a lot better than I have been previously able to, the amount of slip in the rear wheels, to sort of hook it around corners a little bit better. And yeah, I just found that it did improve my overall lap time and improve the driving experience. So I'm willing to overlook the little niggles that I had with the build quality when you consider the driving experience with this Handbrake. So I would definitely recommend this as a fantastic Handbrake, especially for the money as well. I don't really think you can go wrong with it. With the shifter, yeah, look, as I said in the driving section again, I struggled to get along with this. You know, fundamentally, I think the design is great. I really love what they've done with the magnetic mechanism. I think that it's got the right idea, and I really do think that it's something that can be improved upon in the future. But, you know, when you consider the price and the fact that, you know, comparing it directly to the ALOG's one, which we will be reviewing in a couple of days' time, you know, this costs pretty much exactly the same amount if you don't count shipping. And obviously the cost of shipping is going to vary depending on where you are in the world, because they come from different countries. But it just feels like a high quality product. You know, it doesn't have any flex in it whatsoever, no movement, no slop. It's completely solid. There's no funny vibrations or squeaks or clicks or creaks or anything like that. And while it does have a significantly shorter throw than this one does, you know, by design, I feel like I should prefer this one to this one. But yeah, just in implementation, it ends up being this one being the clear winner over this one, at least in my opinion. But again, it is a subjective thing. Some people will disagree with me. Some people will love the longer throw of this shifter, and that's perfectly valid as well. But for me, I'm not a huge fan of the 3D printed finish. I'm not a huge fan of the slack that's there, because it's something that I'm constantly aware of when I'm driving, and something that I find I have a habit of playing with, and it just removes from that overall immersion. So yeah, a little bit more difficult to recommend the shifter from my perspective, but definitely a big thumbs up for the Handbrake. But let me know in the comments, as I said, let me know your experience, because as a community, it's best if we all share our experiences, so that people that are looking at buying these products can draw from all of our experiences, not just mine, because I'm just one person sharing my experience and my opinion at the end of the day. But I think that pretty much wraps up today's review. So thank you very much for watching. Do leave a thumbs up if you've enjoyed the video, and consider subscribing and hitting the notification bell too if you haven't already, so you don't miss future videos. As I said, we do have the review of the shifter and Handbrake from ALOG's coming up in the next few days, a whole bunch of driving content, and we do have some really exciting hardware reviews coming up over the next few weeks, as well as some really big changes to the channel, with my brother coming on board as an employee to help out with some videos as well. So big things happening. Great time to get subscribed. But thank you very much as always for watching, and I'll see you guys again soon. Bye. Bye.